The Deccan has been considered as a battleground between two religious cultures by most historians working on medieval India. The river Krishna was considered to be the historiographical dividing line between Vijayanagar, which provided the Hindu bulwark, and the Bahmani kingdoms, which was ruled by successive generations of Muslim sultans. I would like to take up this discussion by trying to examine whether these historical debates had any validity or not. I would like to begin with the foundation of the Bahmani kingdom. Its founder was an Afghan whose name was Alauddin Hassan. He was patronized by a Brahmin named Gangu, and for a long time he was known as Gangu Hassan. Later, he himself took the title of Alauddin Hassan Bahman Shah. He claimed that it was after a half-mythical hero from Iran, Bahman Shah, that he derived his name. But some historians claim that it was actually after his Brahman protector that the name was given to him, but the kingdom ultimately came to be known as the Bahmani kingdom. Now, the Bahmani kingdom actually was continuously in conflict with Vijayanagar. But this conflict was very much more economic and political rather than for any religious reasons. The areas over which the conflict occurred were mainly three. One was the Tungabhadra Doab. This was extremely fertile, but apart from that, it also controlled some of the trade in the area. The other was the Krishna Kaveri Valley, and the Krishna Kaveri Valley had some of the ports located there, from which the products of the region found an outlet. Finally, the third and the most important area was what was known as the Maratha country or the Konkan coast, where Goa was situated. Now, through this area came actually the horses, and these horses were from Iran and Iraq. India did not breed very good war horses, so this was extremely important, and both sides were contending for these regions. Now, the war continued for a long time, and we find in the reign of Devarai I, when Firoz Shah was ruling Bahmani kingdom, that the war actually came to a particular point. Now, during this period when Firoz Shah and Devarai were fighting, Devarai actually slaughtered an entire garrison of the Bahmani soldiers. And Firoz Shah was so angry that he decided that he was going to invade Vijayanagar himself. The Bahmani army came into Vijayanagar, and the Vijayanagar army retreated into the forest area. But war still continued. And finally, both sides were exhausted, and a treaty was concluded in 1367. The importance of this treaty is that it provided a kind of a landmark in the conflict of Vijayanagar and Bahmani kingdoms. It also gave the history of Deccan a significant point to remember regarding how military ethics were to be conducted. It was decided for the first time that no aggression was to be carried on in either countries where totally helpless, unarmed men, women and children were to be slaughtered. Now, naturally, these clauses were not agreed upon in the later years, but that a humane approach was being taken two wars in general definitely came to the forefront. Apart from that, Devarai I was made to give a lot of money, pearls, elephants, and also a daughter in marriage to Firoz Shah. Now, this marriage alliance is also very significant in the history of the Deccan. It's not that marriages had not taken place between the Muslims and the Hindu rulers before. But in this particular marriage, there was a great deal of pomp and grandeur. And it is said that a particular ritual was followed which made it clear that the Bahmani kingdoms were being accepted not only as equal but as a relationship with two groups of ruling classes which were acceptable to both. Firoz Shah, after he walked in to the marriage panel, he was met by Devarai, and the two rulers moved down, and then the entire clan of the Vijayanagar ruling families joined them, and they met in the hall where the marriage was to take place. This was in some ways ritualization of diplomatic behavior. But that this was being done shows very clearly that the conflict was not confined within a narrow Hindu and Muslim political spheres only. Now, what needs to be remembered is that the two kingdoms, in spite of their marriage alliances, in spite of the various treaties that they signed, were able to come to a kind of understanding so that wars would not take place at all. Wars were continuing, but in between what happened was the developments of these kingdoms. I will confine myself more to the development of the Bahmani kingdom as it occurred during Firoz Shah and his successors. Now, Firoz Shah was very much a learned man. He knew many languages, and it is said that he had many wives. His harem was full of women from different countries, and he was able to converse with each of them in their own mother tongue. For example, he not only knew Persian, Arabic, and Turkish, but he also knew Kannada and the southern languages. Now, this very erudite man was also a great patron of art and architecture, particularly architecture. He had huge mosques built, and he had a city built known as Firozabad. Now, all this showed that Bahmani kingdoms were undergoing a period of prosperity. But on the other hand, what we find is wars were also continuing. And after a period when Firoz Shah was defeated by the Vijayanagar army and contingent, he was forced to abdicate in favor of his brother Ahmed Shah. Ahmed Shah was a man who was considered to be very much more pious than Firoz Shah. But at the same time, Ahmed Shah realized that the Bahmani kingdom must keep on expanding. And if that meant that they were going to fight with the Muslim powers in the south and the Deccan, they were prepared to do so. One of the important developments during the period of Ahmed Shah was Warangal, which had at one point helped the other enemies of the Bahmanis, was now taken up as a target, and Ahmed Shah marched against Warangal and actually tried to defeat them. So you see, the arena of war was continuously expanding. But even then, during this period, there were also other developments. For example, during this period, a Persian adventurer rose to power. His name was Mahmud Gawan. he came to the Bahmani kingdom and they realized, and he entered the services of the Bahmani kings. They realized that he was a very talented man. He was picked up and given a title, Malik ul Tuzar, but after a while he became the prime minister and was called Peshwa. Now, Malik Gawan was a very learned man. Apart from that, he was also a very good administrator. He divided the kingdom into various districts which were called tarafs, and these were now being governed by men who were known as tarafdars. Now, this kind of an administrative setup was very important for a country which was trying to centralize its powers. So, in a way, men like Muhammad Gawan brought in ideas from outside the Bahmani kingdom, but at the same time, having applied them and brought it under a cohesive system, they made the prosperity of Bahmani kingdom absolutely sure. After a particular period, Mahmud Gawan had to come up against the hostility of the nobles. Now, this is something that we have to remember also. In the politics of Deccan, it was not only countries fighting other countries. That is, it was not Bahmani kingdom fighting Warangal or the Bahmanis fighting the Vijayanagar people. But there were internal fights and dissensions taking place all the time. Particularly in the Bahmani kingdom, there were two sets of people. One set were those who were the original inhabitants who were the Deccanese, and the others whom they called the foreigners. Sometimes they were also known as the Garibs. Now, Mahmud Gawan was after all from Persia, and it is said that he was never accepted by the nobility, though he made many overtures to the Bahmani nobles and tried to win them over. Finally, he was killed at the age of 70 and above. And then the whole administrative structure that he had very carefully built up was actually under collapse. Now, after this, what we find is that the Bahmani kingdom was slowly disintegrating, and a large number of smaller principalities were vying for power among each other. The three which became very important was Bijapur, Golconda and Ahmednagar. The areas around which they fought were actually Sholapur and a few other territories that belonged to the Bahmani kingdom as well as to the Vijayanagar kingdoms. But they were able to do one thing. All these powers at one point were able to combine, and they defeated the Vijayanagar kings at a battle called Banihatti in as late as 1565. It was in 1565 that finally the Vijayanagar Empire collapsed and gave way to these smaller kingdoms which were coming into power and who ultimately fought against Akbar. The important part that we have to stress is not the actual battles that took place in the Deccan. What we have to try and analyze are the different characteristics of Deccani politics from the other regions. One of the most important factors that has been noticed by historians is that this was not a war between Hindus and Muslims. That there was two expanding powers who were fighting for commercial, economic, as well as political sovereignty. One was the Marathas. The Marathas had for a long time been employed by the members of the Bahmani ruling families as administrators, and quite a few of them were the Marathi Brahmins. In the later period, we find that they had gained more in terms of their political power. In some ways, they acted as a kind of a contrast to those who were coming in from Iran. And those who were coming in from Iran were also members of the Shia community. So actually, the Deccan politics, both in terms of its internal affairs and in terms of its exposure to foreign culture, was actually much larger than we have imagined. The Marathas appeared later on to be a force which was there definitely to contend with by the Mughals in the Deccan. But at the same time, the coming in of the Shias also proved an important point, because once the Shias were leaving Iran, they found greater patronage under Akbar when he became the emperor of the Mughals. But the fact that they had settled in the Deccan first gave them an earlier opportunity. The second thing that we have to remember about Deccan politics is that it was not limited only to their geographical region. It was also linked with what was happening in northern India. Thus, the transformations in the administrative structure and the political changes that were occurring in North India definitely had a bearing on what was happening in Deccan. The third is a very much more cultural phenomena. This was the arrival and the spread of Sufi doctrines in the entire country. It is quite true that the Sufis had come to northern India and had settled down in Delhi. These Sufis were offering an alternative to the orthodox Islamic culture that prevailed in the region. We find that some of the important Sufis who were followers of the Chishti order had also come to the Deccan, and the Bahmani rulers had given them protection. They had also offered them land and let them settle down in terms of hermitages. And the Deccan, therefore, particularly the Bahmani kingdom, became an important center of Sufi religious authority, which was considered to be unlimited. The other thing that we have to remember is that along with the coming of the Sufis, the building of the Khankas, there were now religious institutions like the madrasas and the colleges of divinity. And Feroz Shah had started patronizing them. Muhammad Gawan had also helped in building madrasas, and we find in the later years tremendous building activity going on in this entire region. One of the important things was the contrast with, in terms of style, between the two forms of architecture that were developing quite fast in the Deccan during this period. One was the temples that were growing up in the Vijayanagar area. And not only temples, but even palaces and other structures which were secular were actually illustrated and decorated with a lot of plastic exuberance, that is, figurative motifs and vegetal and ornamental drawings. Whereas the architecture that was followed in the Deccan was actually what was brought from Iran and from Central Asia. It had a definite Islamic character. The arches, the domes, and the use of building materials like cement and mortar gave it a different kind of a look altogether. There was a penchant for light and space, which was not there in the temples. And this again opened up the whole scheme of architecture into another area. Now, what I would like to take up here is also the fact that Islam, in the way that it developed in the Deccan, formulated what historians like Eaton have called an Islamicate culture, not something which is hidebound or narrowly confined within a kind of an Islamic cultural zone, nor did it have a kind of a political hegemonic center in Delhi. This broadening or opening up of Islamic cultural zones made Islam, particularly the Sufi culture, into a civilizing factor. And this was to be seen more and more in Deccani art. In the later period, in the period of the Adil Shahs, we have a new language in painting developing, a Victorian language where the dynastic exploits and epic victories of the Deccani sultans are actually taken into account and which are being illustrated. So, this entire area became a center of alternative culture which included both the mystic influences of Hinduism and the Sufistic mysticism of the Central Asia, and brought them all within multiple cultural strands. And this was celebrated over and over again by all the Muslim divines of the period and even the men who wrote the history. Now, the question to which I shall come back in terms of my conclusion is that why was this attitude adopted by historians of medieval Deccan that the river Krishna was actually a historiographical dividing line between a Hindu Deccan and a Muslim Deccan. This actually came from some of the medieval historians of the Deccan themselves. These men like Tabatabai, like Ferishta, were people from Iran. And they saw this whole region as a place of cultural colonization. They looked upon the non-Muslims as infidels, and those who were of an inferior educational breed as completely subservient to what should be the Islamic cultural norms of the ruling class. But even while their writings celebrated in a kind of epic form the victories of their patrons, they were being sucked into the regional political literature which gave rise to another kind of historical consciousness. So while one group of historians saw in the Deccan the conflict between two cultures, another group of historians who were looking at the popular culture of the region, the growth of a regional language, regional art, found in the Deccan the ground where the two cultures met.